take care of the livestock and farm animals, for their food. So he learned a lot from her and from his family history and his parents. And I think, although he grew up in a very, metropolitan area of San Francisco, and, his parents had white-collar jobs and everything, he always wanted to have a retirement place. I grew up hearing that since I was old enough to, get in the car and know where we were going to look at property. We were looking in Monterey. We were looking up in Lake County, Napa, Sonoma, all kinds of vineyards, but mainly looking at farmland, because before they got into wine. My parents always had cocktail parties back in the 50s and 60s, and all of the family would come. All of my aunts and uncles and grandparents and cousins would come, and their friends, and they always had all of the various kinds of alcohol, but we always had wine. We always had wine at those parties, and I can remember seeing Wente and Mondavi and Sutter Home and Ficklin Port, and those kinds of things were always available. And even though my grandfather on my dad's side liked whiskey better, and bourbon better, and so did my mother's father, a lot of the family steered away from hard liquor, and they drank wine. But my parents don't remember that. Because I was the height that I could read a label, at 5 or 6 or 7, but it was always in the liquor cabinet, and the wine was laid down, and they would buy it for parties and that sort of thing. So I think my parents both had an interest in wine, and they were on this flight to Hawaii, and they met Hank Bartolucci and his wife Jewel, and they were owners of the family was owners of Oakville
Great Winery,
Oakville, what did they call it? Oakville, well, it was an Oakville winery, but it was over there in Napa. And the brothers had had a dispute and kind of broken up the properties and divided it several ways, Hank's brothers. And he was interested in looking at property up in Lake County as an investment. Mondavi was getting a lot of their fruit from up there. There'd been wineries, award-winning wineries back in the late 1800s there in Lake County. So, and Lake County used to be part of Napa, used to be part of the same county, and got, I don't know why, divided up at one point. So my parents were talking with the Bartoluccis, and it turned out that the Bartoluccis were quoting studies done at UC Davis that indicated where walnut trees and pears grew well, so would vines, so would table wine grapes. So Jess started looking into that, and he eventually found this property up in Lake County on the advice of Hank Bartolucci. Hank was moving up there with his son, Ron Bartolucci, who became our first vineyard manager. And we planted grapes up there. We bought the property in '73. It was an old homestead of the Covey family that had come out on covered wagon in the late 1800s, mid 1800s. They brought fruit trees and livestock, and they didn't have enough water to keep their livestock alive, so they ate their livestock, and they fed the water to the trees. And so we still have up there some 150-year-old quince trees,
big trees this big, right?
walnut trees, and some different fruit cherry trees. Unfortunately, our old fig tree died. It got some disease or something after 120 some odd years.
There's still one though on the corner of the property.
Yeah. So there are a lot of old fruit trees on this property, the original 80 acres that we purchased. So we purchased it in '73, right before I started college, when I was 17, and when I was 18, we were up there planting grapes. And that's where Laura and I spent every summer vacation, spring break, winter break. We were up at the Lakeport property helping to plant these grapes. And we tried to keep the pears, the pear orchard. There's 13 acres of pears remaining on the property, and just tried to do it organic. But it just didn't fly. They weren't sophisticated enough, and all of our neighbors complained that we were introducing pests into their, we were a population zone for pests. Apparently, because we weren't sulfuring and doing all the ordinary things, they used some pretty heavy duty sprays for pear orchards. So we had walnut trees on the property. We preserved quite a few of those. Unfortunately, not as many as I wanted to preserve, but beautiful walnuts, and a lot of trees were preserved on the property originally so that we could plant our vines in the open spaces, pasture land, and orchard land that was there. So we had that back in 73, and by 78 we were selling our grapes. I can remember driving around with Jess. I was always really embarrassed. He would just drop in on people. He dropped in on the Parducci's. He dropped in on the Fetzers. He dropped in on Glen Ellen,
Benzinger.
Bruno Benziger. Always just embarrassed the heck out of me because he was dropping in on these people without an appointment. But, they were all farmers. They all lived with their families out in the country where they had their vineyards in Mendocino and in Napa and Sonoma. So I got to meet a lot of really great people really early on. They probably don't remember meeting me. I'm sure they remember meeting Jess. and he just had a lot of audacity and would just drop in on people. I've since learned that this is a real typical Texas trait. His parents were both raised in Texas, and people just drop in on neighbors. They don't knock. All they do is knock. They don't call. They just ring the doorbell or knock on the door and expect to be invited in right on the spot. Doesn't matter if you just got out of the shower or you're in your nightgown. So I think he learned that kind of welcoming attitude and just assuming he was welcome and wanted to talk. So we sold our first crops to the Fetzers, and Barney Fetzer had a glut of grapes after 77, 78, and in 79 he was refusing delivery of grapes from Jackson Vineyard over in Lake County. So Jess got really angry and instigated a whole investment in the idea of a winery. And this is back at a time where there were probably maybe 600 wineries. You have to check the facts on this, but I think there were 600 wineries in the state, and better than half of them were going under because there was this glut. Late 70s, early 80s. So by the time we had built our winery in 82, there were still, the drought issues and grape glut issues and all these different things.
Not a great time to start a winery.
It was a really hard time to start a winery. And yet, he had the commercial courage, as you call it, and the fortitude to see it through, even at a time where his law practice was really booming. He had a lot of really big cases. And in those days, it was kind of feast or famine with the kind of contingency work that he did. He got a contingency fee. If he won his cases, he won every single case. But it would take years because they would go up on appeal. And especially with the state or federal government, it might take years before he would get paid. So we had a lot of our clients paying him in the form of used cars or different kinds of deals that they would work out to help. He had to get loans to float his law practice for the lean times, and he had a really great relationship, I believe, at that time with Wells Fargo Bank, and that's where he went to get a loan to build Kendall Jackson, the original winery. And that was probably in the late 70s, early 80s. And that's right when I started law school. My sister Laura was home from UC Santa Barbara. She never graduated. She came home and just put her to work in the basement of our family home in Hillsborough. And his law office was run separately, in Burlingame, where he had an office. He had a building there for over 20 years. My parents had a lot of real estate investments, and all of those investments went to, including the sale of our family home, went into the building of Kendall Jackson, the very foundation of it. So every penny they had went into that. And that caused a lot of conflict between my parents. My mother wanted to take it slow. She was watching other wineries and other families start out really slow. I think Ferrari Carano was one example, where they're taking a lot of classes that you see. Davis, and in fact, we all did take classes. Laura and I took classes there, the ones that you can take, weekend, degrees, and we all took classes there. Jess and my mother Jane and Laura and I all took classes there on the weekends, summers, and that sort of thing. But we ended up with before the winery started, we ended up with this grape, concern that we had all these grapes and no place to sell them. And that really was the inspiration. So they started investigating probably in 79 or 80. They looked at labels, they looked at different names. We had a really funky name. We call it the lawyer pinstripe label. It was called Chateau du Lac. And, Jess and Jane had taken a trip to Europe in 74 and tasted wines and looked at different, regions and learned a lot about wine that way. And so by 79, we had taken another family trip in 78, and then that was the first time I'd been to Europe. And Laura and I were there with our parents and grandparents, my father's parents. So we were there doing all of that, and the following year in 79, Laura took a hiatus to work at home. And I went to law school, and with the first day of law school, I met Don. And so I didn't know at that point that my parents were so serious about building a winery. I mean, we had a vineyard, an established vineyard at that point. We had some award-winning wines under the Fetzer label. It was really fun. And we had some Negociant labels as well, and the Jackson Vineyard. I think that's what they called it, the Jackson Vineyard, by these different labels. And we ended up between 79 and 82, when Don and I graduated from law school, they had already started construction on the winery in 82, which came as a huge shock to me. They were really actually promoting me through law school in a way to not sidetrack me with the fact that the family was building this winery and that we were stressed financially. And it was really a tough time. So just like to take credit for introducing me to Don, just like I take credit for introducing Haley to Max and Max to Haley. But actually, it's the other way around. I wouldn't let my dad meet Don for about a year. I dated him for about a year before my parents met him, because I knew, as Don says now, Jess could hire anybody to do anything, and I knew he would, and he did. He just took Don under his wing, and Don pretty much from 1980, when he met Jess, so the year after we met, he took Don under his wing and involved him in his law practice. Don clerked for him and worked his way through law school that way, and helped me work my way through law school. I didn't even know that my dad was not paying Don, but putting that towards my tuition at law school. I didn't even find that out until last year when he told our son that. I never knew that he made that sacrifice for me so that I could finish law school. And it was a dream I had to follow in my dad's footsteps, because if you ever saw him in the courtroom, he, just as he was very charismatic in the wine business, he was extremely charismatic and a compelling, trial attorney, just an amazingly persuasive trial attorney. Judges and juries alike, whether it was a jury trial or a judge trial, he was amazing on the floor. And I think that was the main reason I wanted to go to law school. But I wanted to go to law school to work in environmental law. That's where I wanted to head. So for me now, fast forward 35 years later, for me it is a fantastic, dream come true that our family, and with Katie Jackson, my sister, at the helm, we are leaders, not only in the wine industry, but in the United States. we're one of the top leaders in sustainability. So I'm extremely proud of that, and it speaks to our origins. And Jess always had a concern about the environment, and I think that's another fantastic legacy that we're getting to enjoy now, going all the way back to riparian creeks and